is now filming and recording. So we were filming the other day, and we're going to continue now. And thank you, Jason, for sharing your story with us. I'm not. We were finishing off, I think, at the end of the attack. Had you made it back to?
Yeah. Okay. So I think we stopped where I was talking about. I was just starting to get into the police involvement, right? So, as I mentioned, the police didn't show. They didn't come to the boat that night, but we did end up somehow getting to the police station. Somebody drove us, or we took a cab, because Steve and I at least Steve gave his statement, and I went with him just to accompany him. The next morning, I was back at the station again, giving my statement. And while I was at the station, that's when the forensics guys went over to the boat, and they did the usual fingerprints and, checking the place out. Maybe even talking to some of the locals who were still sort of in that area when the attack happened. Excuse me. So the police were on the boat for a while. This is what I was told, because Dave gave me the lowdown on what happened while I was gone. The detectives took all the fingerprints. They were there for a short time, and then they left. So by the time I got back to the boat, the guys had already moved the boat off of that giant concrete pier, where you can see it in one of those videos, and we were tied up to some fishing boats. And what happened from that point on, it was basically we were to wait for a couple of days just to see if they could, maybe they could catch the guys, get some of our stuff back, that was stolen, that kind of thing. So in the meantime, one of the police detectives sort of assigned one of the local guys, one of the guys that did work for them. He assigned them to our boat, so he was on the yacht for the rest of the time we were there, sort of acting as a lookout. So whenever we were asleep, for example, at night, he would be sleeping in the aft cockpit, sort of, as a lookout, so that everybody in the area knew that, we were protected, I suppose. Excuse me. So it was, I think, 2 days. Oh, and the other thing too is, at that point, and again, as you'll see in the videos that I've posted, climbing over all of the boats, right, going from one boat to the other to get onto the pier where that fish market was. We naturally started talking to the locals. Well, I did anyway, because I'm just used to doing that anyway, to chatting with anywhere I was in the world. I would do the same thing. I would establish, rapport with people and talk to the locals, and because I'm interested anyway in knowing who they are, and what their perspectives are on things, etc. So just as a natural sort of thing, I'm talking to people. And a few of the locals actually came up to me immediately, and because they knew who we were by that time, and expressing their sadness about what happened. There was at least 2 people who told us immediately that if they'd known that that's what we were doing, that we were anchoring for the purposes of staying there overnight, they would have told us right away. So in other words, what I'm saying is, I found out from the locals that this sort of thing is known to the locals to happen all the time. Now with the police, it was a different kind of a situation. They sort of expressed not shock, but they expressed surprise, right? But the locals are like, yeah, this goes on all the time. So anyway, there was one guy that I, it wasn't a sort of a friendship. Like, I mean, we were only there for less than a week, but it was more than just a rapport. We got to know him, and he got to know us. And in fact, before I left, I helped him and his dad get his boat. His boat had been tied up to that pier in front of the fishing village for years. So the engine wasn't working at that point. I think it was like a 60 foot fishing boat. So like a motor yacht, but it used as a fishing vessel. But they had turned it into a sort of a metal shop. So it had been sitting there for so long. So I helped them. They had to untangle all the lines because, again, years sitting there, there are all kinds of lines that were attached to their boat and they were attached to other boats. And so we got all that sorted out and had to push them out. And then somebody was to tow them out into that bay, into the harbor where our attack took place. And then they would drop anchor, and then that's where they would sit. And then he and his dad would do this mechanical repair work on that yacht. So I got to know him that way. But before we even got to that point where we had helped him to move the yacht out, this young boy actually became angry. It sort of took me aback a little bit, but he was really angry because he said, almost in an accusatory manner, he was saying, well, why didn't you come to us, man? Like, he was really, really angry that this attack happened on our yacht. And he said, I could have told you right away, I could have told you not to anchor there. I would have told you to anchor another, 100 yards away and closer to the part of it was sort of a man-made part of land, like it's a landfill that sort of juts out into the sea and curves a little bit to give a little bit more protection to Praya Bay. But he said if we had anchored closer to that area, there's a good chance that would have happened. But anyway, according to this young man, this happens all the time. And he was really, really angry that happened to us, especially because in his mind, if we had gone to him or at least taken the time to dinghy over and walk around a little bit and introduce ourselves, he said he would have told us right away to not anchor there because apparently it happens all the time. So, and that of course is when I found out. If you look at the video, the daytime video, you'll see where I'm pointing the camera up to that sort of bluff or the cliff off into the distance. That's actually the neighborhood where a lot of the criminal element, I guess you could say, they live in that area. So with binoculars, that's a perfect spot for them to see all the boats, all the visiting yachts in that anchorage. And of course it was a very easy task for them to do for us because we were the only ones there. And so yeah, and actually I just realized I didn't put my phone on airplane, so hopefully no one will call through because that automatically disconnects the recording. So anyway, barreling through this. So there was that aspect of it. Got to know a few of the other people, lots of other people came forward to say how sorry they were that happened to us. A lot of them stating the same thing, it's terrible because that happens here all the time. Anyway, a couple of days later, we get a phone. By that time do we have a radio or not? Anyway, somehow the message was relayed to us that we need to go down to, and before I get to that, I want to talk about the little emergency handheld GPS beacon that Dave had, the other crew member from South Carolina. So the purpose of that is, and you can take this with you anywhere, right? You're registered in your name, you have emergency contact phone numbers in it, this kind of thing. I don't think, with the one Dave had anyway, you can't actually use it to communicate like a handheld radio. But in Dave's case, after the attack that same night, in fact, almost immediately after, he pulled it out and he said, "I've got this emergency beacon, this GPS alert," and he hummed and hawed a little bit. Should I do it? Should I? Because
Activate it, yeah.
should I activate it? Because once activated, the emergency signal then would go to his wife in South Carolina. So anyway, he decided to do it. He hit the button, and so guys, what I'm telling you is those things do work. So all the way from the Cape Verde Islands to South Carolina, his wife got the emergency notification. And Dave told me afterwards that his wife's immediate thought was, okay, they've been attacked. That's the only reason why Dave would, because it would be no other reason, right? They've been attacked on the yacht, and sure enough, her intuition was correct. But anyway, those things do work, guys. So what happened then, of course, Dave's wife immediately contacted the embassy, and then she got things in motion, and sure enough, Dave was contacted by someone from the American embassy in the Cape Verde Islands, the island of Santiago. No Canadian embassies, unfortunately, anywhere in the Cape Verdes. The nearest Canadian embassy, I believe, was in Senegal. So anyway, fast forward now back to, we were notified that some of our things were found, and possibly they found the guys that did the robbery. So for the first time in my life, I was being called in to look at mugshots, right? So I think one of the police detectives picked us up, drove us over. It was a different police station this time. It wasn't the main headquarters where Steve and I ended up that first night. So we walk into this different police station. He takes us into a room, and immediately it felt like a storage space. There were backpacks, computers. It looked like a sporting goods store, frankly. So that room was filled with all of the things that had been stolen from people over the years, but hadn't been claimed, right? And I don't know, just to clarify, I don't know if all of that stuff came from yachts or not. But in any case, they had Dave's backpack, which the robbers had used to put all the gear into, right? All the things that they stole. They had my very expensive watch. They had Steve's computer. They had a couple of things, but that's it. So like no wallets were returned. Not my wallet wasn't returned anyway. Maybe one of the other wallets were returned. A couple of the phones were returned. My phone was, minus the SIM card. In fact, any phones that were returned came back to us minus the SIM cards. And they had a couple of knives. One of the knives that looked exactly like, the big Bowie or the big hunting knife. They had that. It looked very similar. Now, there's no way I could possibly say definitively that was the knife, right? Because there's just no way, right? But it did look like one of the knives, or the knife that the ringleader had with him. So then they got around to showing us the photos. We saw 2 photos only. I didn't recognize one of the guys, like 100%. There was no way I could have identified him as one of the guys. But the other photo looked very much like the ringleader, because the ringleader also had a little sort of I don't know if I don't know, in Canada we call them beauty marks or beauty spots or whatever. What's another word for that? Not exactly a mole, but some kind of a mark on beside his eye. But the problem was, and I zeroed in on him right away, he looked familiar, but the problem was when they came on board that night they attacked us, they had these real cool looking dreadlocks, right? That that Africans have, right? Like at least down to their shoulders, and they had beads in them, and you know, that cool way they set it up. And in fact, that reminds me, at one point, it had occurred to me that, like, to me, like, I don't know what a typical robber looks like. I've never seen a robber up close, but to me, they looked more like, you know, fashion magazine models, right? With their cool hair, and you know, they were all young, attractive, sort of looking guys. And you know, I remember thinking how bizarre this was, because you would expect robbers to be, you know, people who looked, you know, down and out and scraggy, and you know. Anyway, so I was looking at his photo, but in the photo, in the mugshot, his head was shaved clean. And, well, I was going to say, for a man, men or women, anybody that has a shaved head looks, in my mind, completely different, right, than what they would look like with hair. So I looked closely, and I was like, I don't know, 95% sure that I was looking at the ringleader in that photo, but of course I couldn't say 100% for sure. So I said, I'm not sure. In fact, I didn't even tell the police that I'm 95% sure. I just said, no, I can't say for sure if it was him or not. However, I think the others did identify him, and and I wasn't sure how they were able to do that, especially Steve, because Steve wasn't engaged. Like, he was completely incapacitated the entire time, right? So I don't know how he could have the memory to be able to do that. But anyway,
So I did want to ask you, how were the others reacting during the attack? You were mainly focused on trying to keep things,
right.
But what do you recall about?
Well, I talked about how I turned to Steve at one point, and is as inconspicuously as possible, nearing the end of the attack, where I turned to Steve so that the attackers wouldn't notice, and I said something like, you know, it's if they come for us, Steve, it comes down to you and me, right? If they try to kill us, so get ready, right? And I looked at his eyes, and he just had that glazed over sort of look, so he wasn't there at all.
He was in shock?
Yeah, he didn't even register what was there. So, well, let's start with Mary. She was extremely bewildered, frustrated, totally stressed out, because she was the one they were using to go up and down, to go below and bring up, you know, money and computers and whatever valuables they were asking her for. I managed to keep her calm by talking to her and saying, you know, stay calm, Maggie, because at one point, while she was still standing, while she was going back and forth, she started to, you know, to get, what's the word I'm looking for? To get a little hyper, right? And she started to say things like, you know, I take heart pills, and you know, and this kind of thing. So she was starting to, what's the word I'm looking for here?
Hyperventilate, or?
Not hyperventilate, just to become extremely agitated, right?
Right.
But once they were satisfied with all the loot that she had brought up from below, and they had her sitting down again, she started to calm down, and I didn't see her at that point, because she was on the other side of Steve, who was right beside me. And I was trying not to move my head too much, because I didn't want to attract attention to myself, right? Because while all this was going on, I was still trying to formulate a plan of defense, right? Because very soon we would get to that moment of truth, that defining moment where I would know whether the attackers were just going to leave, or whether they were going to try to kill us, right? To say it as plainly as possible. Steve, on the other hand, he was completely incapacitated the entire time. In fact, he wasn't even compelled at any point to feel like assisting his wife, right? Now, the fact that I took leadership role immediately may very well have calmed him down in that sense, where, you know, his senses, like he was sort of allowed, if I can use that word, allowed to sort of stay in that numb state because somebody else had already taken that leadership position. But yeah, so he was completely incapacitated the entire time. He didn't utter a word until at the end. I think I mentioned in the previous video where when they tried to come back again with the rope, right, to tie us up, and again I said no tie, no tie. And I'm pretty sure I heard Steve and Dave at that point. They were starting to come around and they were starting to get their voices back. So in very quiet voices, I think I heard them say, yeah, no tie, no tie.
And what about
as a way to back me up.
What about Dave?
Dave, yeah. I always smile when I think of Dave because just because I liked Dave very much anyway. He's a great traveling companion and he's got all kinds of experience and he's just a classy sort of guy, very much like me. But I'm laughing also because I did turn to look at Dave at one point because it was important for me to get a gauge of where everybody was. Steve, Dave, right? Because it was important for me as I'm formulating, you know, this possible plan of defense, right? And Dave, all I remember with Dave is Dave wasn't engaged with them either, but he wasn't fully incapacitated and in shock the way Steve was. But Dave was sitting there with his arm up on top of the nav station because he was right beside the nav station, right? And I just remember Dave, he had this disgusted look on his face. He just had this disgusted look on his face, and I can almost imagine, you know, with the cartoons where you've got the little bubble above the cartoon so that you know what the cartoon character is saying or thinking, right? And I can just imagine Dave thinking like, man, I'm too old for this shit, you know. And because Dave too, and I'm not laughing at the situation, it's just, hey, I'm not gonna explain why I'm laughing. I'm laughing because it's just making me laugh, right? But Dave did have a serious bout with cancer. So I think this was Dave's sort of return to the sea for this epic voyage. You know, maybe even his, you know, that one last hurrah, that one last voyage, because he was 70 years old at that time. But he beat the cancer and he was, I think this was his first, you know, step back into the nautical world. And now he's facing this. So yeah, I just remember him sitting here like this with his head down, almost shaking his head, you know, with this disgusted look on his face. That's what I remember about Dave. So yeah, but I distinctly got the impression that Dave, you know, he wasn't engaged with them in the way I was, but he wasn't completely incapacitated the way Steve was. So in fact, once the attackers had closed the sliding door and they were out in the aft cockpit making their getaway, Dave immediately became Dave again, and he stood up and, you know, he was thinking about, you know, he was now part of the process about, you know, okay, what do we do now, kind of thing, right? So yeah. Oh, and the other thing that I forgot too, little bits and pieces are still coming back as I'm relating the story. At one point near the end, Mary then started to cry out about her laptop, and I remember thinking, you know, oh man, do we really need to do this right now? Just let these guys leave, right? But she was crying on about my laptop, please, begging them, pleading, don't take my laptop. My whole life is on my laptop. She was running some sort of a makeup supply company over the internet, through the internet. So clearly, had the robbers taken her laptop, they would have left her high and dry, like completely shut off from all the work that she had done and was currently doing for this business she was running. And I don't remember much about it, but I somehow managed to convince the guy, as crazy as this sounds, to leave her laptop. So, yeah, again, true story. They left her laptop. Now, it could also be the fact that, you know, it wasn't, you know, like an Apple computer. It was a smaller sort of, you know, well-used computer laptop. So maybe they figured, well, you know, it doesn't look like we can get much for it anyway. You know, if they tried to resell it, I don't know what their thinking was. But I actually convinced them to leave that laptop. So again, that's something, you know, for anybody that runs into a situation like that, you definitely don't start, you know, pleading them to leave your laptop behind, because you're keeping them, you know, you want them to get off the yacht as soon as possible, right? And here, Mary was re-engaging them about a laptop, creating tension, and, you know.
When they were almost gone.
Yeah, so.
So to change gears for a moment.
Can you hold that thought for just
yes.
2 secs? And your question may very well segue into what I'm going to finish up with here. So regarding about how people were and how they reacted, one point about how Steve didn't feel in any way compelled to assist his own wife, who was in trouble on the yacht. Even after the attackers were gone, his reaction was still this sort of shock that he was in, to the point where because Dave was an older guy, being 70, I thought Steve would take this better from Dave than from me. I told Dave, I said to Dave, you know, Dave, why don't you go and tell Steve to see to his wife, right? Because Mary was still sort of wandering around, you know, talking and then letting her anxiety out, and Steve, you know, he wasn't doing anything to, you know. So then Dave went over and said, hey, Steve, you know, why don't you re-engage with Mary, and then, you know, sit down with her and, you know, and be with her, right? Just be with her. And then it was shortly after that when Steve and Mary then went below to try to get some sleep, right? But there was no instinct in him at all, in Steve, to comfort, you know, his own wife, you know. That was kind of odd. But again, people react differently, and frankly, I wasn't supposed to react that way either, right? My mammalian brain was supposed to shut, you know, my neocortex down as well, like it did with everybody else. It's just the natural response, you know, from a human being in a crisis situation like that. So. But everybody does react differently. But that definitely did surprise me, that even after the attack, he felt no, you know, he felt no
he was still in his
instinct to
yeah.
see to his wife, to connect with his wife, and just to be with her, right? Because had it been me, I would have immediately gone straight to my wife, right? I would have had a conversation with the entire crew, but I would have immediately went to my wife or my children or whatever, right? So yeah, your question.
So this is shifting gears a little bit, but
yeah, sure.
I do want to come back and talk about, you know, people's reactions. But just thinking now, because you're talking about laptops and material possessions and money and passports and digital equipment. I mean, if Mary had backed up her computer onto an external drive and
yeah.
kept that drive separate.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, and I've been thinking about, like, you know, to have some stuff locked up separately. But so do you have any advice? Because obviously if you hide everything and you give nothing to robbers in this situation,
yes,
that's going to escalate, because they're going to know you have things. So any advice on how to plan for this, so you have something available to give, but separate things?
Yeah, so in this day and age, I think everybody has all their stuff backed up anyhow, right? And you know, you want to avoid having to live in a state of fear or high alert, but sometimes you just have to. So if you're in an anchorage and you're there all alone, it's off season, it's a place you've never been to before, and you've done your research and you know that there have been yacht attacks there before, and you have no choice but to stay in that spot, then definitely be on high alert. Santiago is the perfect place to jump off as your departure point if you're heading across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, right? So there is a safer place to do it, safer than the way we did it. So always have your stuff backed up. I think 90% of the planet does that anyway. And a lot of people actually, they'll have a sort of like a dummy wallet where they'll have a bunch of bills in it to give the impression to the robbers or the attackers that that's your actual working wallet, right? So have like $150 in that wallet that's separate from anything else, so that you can say, hey, this is all I have, this is all of my money, right? And if it looks like it's a working wallet and you've got several denominations and it, it's convincing to a robber that that's it, that's all you've got, and then you can take their focus off of money, and then they can focus then on other things like jewelry or computers or that kind of thing. It just speeds their departure, I think, if you have this dummy wallet already set up. Excuse me. So, but the one main thing that I've seen done always on every single yacht that I've been on is all of the passports are collected, because that's the one thing you definitely do not want to lose, misplace, have stolen, whatever. So all the passports and any documents related to travel, right, are kept separate, typically in one of those waterproof freezer bags, or like there are waterproof bags that you can buy specifically designed for that purpose, and they get stowed away in a completely separate place, right? And I've never heard of a yacht attack where the attackers actually specifically ask for passports. It seems to me though that they would, because there's value in that, right? There's
only if you know who to resell it to, and that probably would bring a lot of attention from embassies, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas cash or quick things that they can sell, that can
yeah.
put a new SIM card in a phone, you can't track that it was the.
Yes,
right?
yeah, true. So in this case, they didn't ask for passports.
Mm-hmm. Money, jewelry.
I don't know. Maybe they did, but they just didn't know the English word, right? Maybe they used, and I think I mentioned in one of the other videos that it's a combination of Creole and Portuguese. And I did a little bit of research actually to give a bit more information to the people who are watching this. That Portuguese apparently still is the official language of the Cape Verdes. But the local language, they call it Creole, and I think it's a mixture of Creole and Portuguese, and that's why I didn't understand a word that the attackers said during the attack. And also too, I wanted to give a little more info about the Cape Verdes in the sense of the ownership, right? Mm-hmm. So in I think it was 1462, somewhere around there, the Portuguese arrived to the Cape Verdes, and it's one of the few instances that I know of where the island was completely, at least an island chain of that size and in such close proximity to a major
a country, naval power.
Yeah, to a country, like, because it's I think it's like 250 miles off the coast of Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And it was uninhabited. So the Portuguese were literally, according to my research, were the first people to get off and actually try to do something with the place. But so of course, you know, mid 15th century, it has that unfortunately ugly history to it, where it basically became a trading stopover place with slaves, African slaves, right? And then it wasn't until 1975 where they regained their independence. So it's been a while since it hasn't been officially, owned by the Portuguese. So, and that explains why so many parts of it, as I mentioned in the previous videos, so many parts of the Cape Verdes just seemed run down, like somebody just basically said, okay, we don't care about maintaining this place anymore, right? And also I mentioned some of the things that my brain was trying to process when the attackers first came onto the yacht, and I was talking about some of the societal sort of norms or conventions or tacit understandings that we would have, say, in a place like North America that other countries, islands in particular, don't have. And I mentioned, I mentioned that the native Indians. Do you have your phone handy by any chance? Yes. Can you just do because it's gone. The Aruk Indians, the native Indians in the San Blas Islands, who are actually still in control. They still govern the islands. And by govern the islands, I mean, I don't know how that relates to administrative, but they certainly, for example, if they see you misbehaving or acting inappropriately or littering, that kind of stuff, they'll come over and tell you, please pick up your whatever, and if you don't, then they'll tell you to leave the islands, and they've done it many times.
So Wikipedia, if that's a credible source, says Cape Verdeans or
No, I'm
Cabo
sorry.
Verdeans?
No, the San Blas Islands.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Aruk? The Aruk Indians?
The Kuna Indians?
Kuna. Aruk, how did I get Aruk?
Thought to be descendants of the Carib Indians.
Okay, so the Kuna Indians, who still govern the San Blas Islands, those are the Indians who came onto the yacht and had their handcrafts and that kind of stuff. They would put them on the railings and whatnot. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about and that was the other unusual thing too. Like, I mean, I took leadership role during the attack, and I think that's just a personality thing. And in the next section, I'll get into that, the sort of the aftermath of why I was able to stay fully engaged during the attack, because one of the reasons why is actually not a good thing. It's because my amygdala has been damaged from things that happened in my childhood, right? Like I said before, I should have really, the fight, flight, or freeze mode, I should have gone into the freeze mode as well, just like everybody else did. It doesn't mean I'm particularly brave or anything like that. It's just my brain wasn't working properly. But it's sort of a fine line too, because I am by nature a leader. I am a nurturer. I am the guy that's always watching. I'm safety conscious. I'm watching, if there's a group of children, for example, around, I'm the guy that's gonna notice, wait a minute, there's supposed to be 5 kids in the group. Where's the 5th? You know what I mean? That's just a natural personality thing with me. But my brain was damaged by childhood trauma that had been suppressed, forgotten, and parts of it I wasn't even aware of, and I couldn't even remember. And this yacht attack actually brought all of that suppressed stuff to the surface, and I'll get to that in the next video. But so in this case, I did take leadership during the attack. I refused to allow the attackers to tie us up, but I wasn't in the leadership role on the yacht. In this case, because the owners were on board, you leave it to the owners to take that role, right? So Steve effectively was the skipper of the vessel, right? Even though I think Dave had more experience, but again, I wasn't there to take the skipper role. I was there specifically because I wanted to use it as another qualifying run for the Yachtmaster Ocean. All I wanted to do was, I was looking forward to the ocean passage, pretty much, to put it in a nutshell, where I could use the sextant to take my sights and do my plottings, right? So after the attack occurred, I kind of sat back and waited for Steve to take the initiative to do what I fully expected would be a group sit down and, okay guys, we've endured this horrible thing, let's talk about it now. There was nothing like that at all with Steve and Mary, nothing. Which really surprised me, because again, had it been my yacht, or had I been the skipper, I definitely would have, had that talk, had that conversation. Not to force anybody, because some crew members might not know how to talk about it, might still not know what they're feeling. Their minds and bodies may not have even processed it yet. But in my experience, most people would at least have one or two things to say and would be grateful just for the sit down, because that sit down then would be the opportunity to say, hey, we're good. This thing happened, but we're good. We're a team again, we're safe, and we're in this situation where it's safe for you to talk about anything you want to, express anything you want, or just say nothing, or shed a tear or two, or to have a group hug or whatever, right? That wasn't done, but I would have done that had I been the skipper of the vessel, and that surprised me. However, Dave and I, we did have our time together. He did it through email, but Dave and I were communicating all through the process anyway, because I was communicating with him for the most part. So for example, whenever we touched down on land, after we left Madeira, it would be Dave and I heading out to do exploring, and we were leaving Steve and Mary, because they're a couple on their dream voyage, right? We would leave them to have as much alone time as possible, right? So it was always me and Dave anyway. But once we got to the other side of the Atlantic, once we got to St. Lucia, then Dave and I, the night before we departed, we had a dinner in a restaurant, and we had that talk, and in fact, Dave, shed a few tears, and he was expressing his emotion for the action that I took. And then in an email afterwards, he was more clear with his expression, and he was basically saying, acknowledging that I may very well have saved everyone's life. I may very well have saved his life, right? And he was acknowledging that and thanking me for the role and the action that I took. But none of that from Steve and Mary. So I think the way they instinctively, or their brains were steering them towards handling it, is just to remain in denial about it, or at the very least just to forget about it, to put it aside. Well, that's sort of denial too, isn't it? I guess. But their minds or brains chose to not deal with it at all. And again, with Dave, it didn't surprise me, because I felt from the very beginning we're sort of kindred spirits, right? So I wasn't surprised that he handled things the way that I did. And Dave too is also a dad, right? And he's a very well-educated man again. So, and sometimes that makes a difference too, because the more educated you are, the more in tune, in my opinion, you are with just the human condition in a general sort of way, right? So I wasn't surprised that he and I were able to have those kinds of conversations. But yeah, so, and then of course this is a good segue into the next videotape. I don't know how long this one's been now, but in the next and final part of this interview, then I'll talk about the aftermath, how I handled the trauma, how my brain handled the trauma, and all the other great things that happened since, because and I hate to use a sort of a religious sort of term, but in a sense, it was almost like a blessing in disguise for me, you know. That attack has brought me to another place, a part of who I am, and has allowed me, has compelled me to come full circle, because I did end up at North York General Hospital, and then I did end up in the main psychiatric hospital here in Toronto, and then ended up with the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, where I am now. I did 4 cycles with them, and now I'm acting liaison, which is pretty cool, for the CCMF, for their Nexus Recovery Group. So,
And that's all being part of your process on dealing with what this brought, like the aftermath of this, and dealing with what this brought back from your childhood.
Totally. Do you have any other questions about the
I
attack?
do, but why don't we take a break now, and then
Cool.
we'll reset.